Engineer David Alexander. David, super stoked to have you on the podcast today, man.
Yes, I'm excited too. Producer, mix engineer. I've played in a bunch of bands, so it's like I play instruments, write music, write songs, and all that kind of stuff.
It's the same as guitar playing. It's the same as music production. It's the same as every other thing. It's just a learned skill that you have to put the reps in order to get better at.
If you give me 5 options, I'm buying the microphone from the mad scientist working in his basement.
I think tips are fine generally. I think tips as gospel is the problem.
You can make pro-level mixes on anything. It's just you need to take the time to understand what that information is that you're receiving.
This episode of the Home Studio Hangout podcast is brought to you by Bliss. Bliss is a French audio developer focusing on developing creative and intuitive synths and effects. They developed over 25 different plugins for Windows, Mac, and iOS for all of my iPhone and iPad producers. You can discover plugins such as the Bliss Monolith, which is a mono synth they have for free, as well as the Bliss Arpeggiator, Bliss Megalith Wavetable Synthesizer, or Bliss Voices, the ultimate vocal harmonizer. Go to bliss.com, that's BLEASS.com, and use the promo code HOMESTUDIOHANGOUT, all one word, to save 20% off of your next order. Thank you to Bliss for sponsoring this episode of the Home Studio Hangout podcast. Now, let's get back to the conversation. Welcome back to the Home Studio Hangout podcast. I'm your host, Drew, not joined by my co-host, Josh, today, but I am joined by LA-based producer, mix engineer, tracking engineer, David Alexander. David, super stoked to have you on the podcast today, man.
Yes, I'm excited too.
Dude, it's going to be a good conversation, good little hour and some to just chat, get to know each other. I feel like this is going to be very much a let's get to know each other kind of chat.
Totally.
So it's going to be a cool little thing. So maybe for the people who don't know you, I know you have a little bit of a solid TikTok following, which is really, really cool. And we can talk about some of that stuff too.
Totally.
Later. But maybe for the people who don't know who you are, 30,000 foot view on who you are, what you do, and kind of who do you serve?
I'm trying to think where to start here. So I've been in some capacity doing audio engineering and all this stuff, honestly, since I was in high school. It was like my fucking senior project was on music recording. And I really just kind of started by, me and one of my good friends growing up. We were just making as much horrible sound as we could, and we would record it any way we could. And then that just kind of spiraled in naturally to working with local bands around the area that I grew up in. And then from there, kind of in my early 20s, I had moved to Portland and already kind of had a client base of local stuff going. And then once I was in Portland, I just kept that up and had a couple different basement studios, kind of DIY spots, and also have done a lot of live sound throughout the years in Portland, which I don't do anymore. Hopefully, will not do anymore. That's a whole different conversation. But yeah, producer, mix engineer. I've played in a bunch of bands, so it's like I play instruments, write music, write songs, and all that kind of stuff. So.
That's awesome. And I know we talked a little bit about it, and you said you came up doing a lot of the more underground genre stuff. And that tends to be who you generally work with, but you're open to kind of whatever.
Oh yeah. I mean, I absolutely, to this day, I mean, I'm a punk till I die. Absolutely. And that whole community and experience and kind of value set that goes along with it is like super kind of instrumental to like my worldview and who I am and kind of how I think about, not only making music, but just like the whole process of being an artist or being in a band and kind of what that means to kind of maneuver through the system that we're inside of. But yeah, I mean, I have a deep love of I love rap and hip hop, and I have a big fascination with pop music, which in a lot of ways is kind of my current deep fascination, just really how music can be so simple but so hard to execute, and kind of how as music becomes more simplistic in its composition, it's like each individual element of that becomes more and more delicate kind of, and and needs
Yeah.
more care taken toward it and stuff like that.
Yeah. But maybe before we get into your history, I want to touch on that real quick because that's really interesting that you say that. So I find a very strong connection between people who came up in hardcore and punk and like underground like rock scenes. Those, underground Brooklyn punk based, those kinds of guys, or even like, your West Coast, Seattle, Portland, LA based punk guys, and the underground hip hop scene have very similar mindsets, though they come from very different walks of life and very different places. Like, I find that those two people get along so well, weirdly. Like,
Yeah,
they are so cut from the same cloth.
def-
It's funny that you say that. Yeah.
definitely. I mean, and I really think that in a lot of ways, like punk music and rap and hip hop have a lot of really similar. Like, I think there's a lot of things that are aesthetically really similar, and I think that there's a lot of things that are kind of like uh, sort of psychically similar. Like, it's ultimately music that is really content based, and it's about talking about real experiences. And I also think in a lot of ways that it's music that kind of exists to undermine the status quo in some way,
Yeah.
and kind of
Generally anti system or anti status quo music.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's music that in though I think we don't always reach this mark in some capacity, it's ultimately working towards like the liberation of oppressed people in some
Hmm.
capacity, in terms of trying to shine light on the way that our society is and the way the system works
Sure.
and what that means.
Or shining the light on like underserved areas, or shining the light on aspects of like, maybe global phenomenons or climate change, or like oil in the Middle East, and like diving into some of those kind of conversations. Inner
Totally.
Shikari is a band that I think does that kind of conversation really, really well,
Yeah, yeah,
where they touch on a lot of those aspects, and they come from punk, very, very hardcore, DIY punk. And
totally.
obviously they've shifted a lot sound wise. It's very, very different now, but like they still, all of that messaging is still very much ingrained in who they are.
Totally. And that kind of stuff is an important thing for me, because like in my journey, like when I was a little kid, it's like, finding punk music and finding that community was so instrumental in terms of like giving me self vision and teaching me about the world. And, in a lot of ways, it's like I learned more through music than I ever would have learned in school, because it was able to open my eyes, to understand, the context I live in, the context other people live in. And I think that that is really one of the most powerful things about music at large, that I sometimes think in our sort of content age gets a little bit lost, that it can really be something that's transformative for people. And so I try to, in whatever way I can, try to tap into that and harness that whenever I can find it.
100%. So maybe diving into, you're talking about when you grew up and kind of found the punk scene.
Yeah.
Was that originally in Portland?
Um,
So originally grew up in Portland?
so I grew up in a super small town that was like literally like a logging town in the forests of
Oh,
Oregon.
nice.
And that was probably like, it was about an hour and a half away from Portland. But I was, in a lot of ways, I was super fortunate. Like, I had a couple, buddies from my hometown, and we were all kind of into slightly different stuff, but we were just sort of the village freaks, so we all hung out together. Um, but I lived relatively close to where Oregon State University is, and so when I was like an early teen, me and my buddy Berkeley, we just wandered in to a house show, and really doing that ended up really changing the course of my life. And we met a bunch of kind of college age kids that really sort of kind of just took us in. And then we ended up, playing shows at the house. And then I ended up joining a band, that was kind of like more traditional kind of hardcore band, with people that I met from there. And then that really sort of exploded my access. It was like, all of a sudden I had rides to shows in Portland, and I was, really before I was out of high school, we were already doing like West Coast tours, and was, kind of went from being pretty secluded to having, just a much broader cultural experience and being able to meet people through music. And was able to really, in a lot of ways, I think, help me kind of escape what was going on in my life as a kid and where I was from. And uh, I mean, I honestly, I think about this a lot now that I'm kind of a bit older, but like, I can't imagine what would have transpired in my life if I would have not, walked into that show. And, I think about that kind of stuff a lot in terms of, working with people with music, or, in my journey with my own music, is like, you never really know what can be the difference between something that changes the course of someone's life versus just, a song to play on your phone. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Well, it's crazy that you say that. So, I'm in South Carolina, but I'm very heavily tied to the Atlanta scene,
Hmm.
just by proxy and by like a lot of the bands in the Carolinas and Georgia. Like we're all like very together. Like it's almost one big scene, though it's not. So like a lot of like my area, Carolina stuff, and then like the Charlotte, Carolina scene and like Raleigh, Carolina scenes. Kind of all tie in with the Atlanta scene as well at large. There's a lot of really cool stuff going on here, even now. And a big thing that I found that was very consistent and that has been consistent for the most part, obviously there's some caveats, is the welcoming nature of new people to the genres. Um, it's very cool to see. So my buddy Ian, who's been on the podcast before, he runs a show, or ran a show. They didn't do it this past year, but he runs a show called The Big Ass Gig in Atlanta. We rent out the Masquerade, which legendary venue in the Southeast, and we rent the biggest room. It's 100% like non-signed bands, like DIY. It's one of the biggest DIY shows, and like we sell it out. It's basically an all-day festival, and that is a big gathering point for a lot of people who are like, I either have a friend that's coming and I'm interested in the scene.
Hmm.
It is very like genre wise a hodgepodge of a bunch of different stuff where it's like underground pop punk or deathcore or whatever. It can kind of go all over the place, and it's a big factor in a lot of people coming there, meeting people, making friends, and then a year later he'll get a message from somebody being like, "Hey, I went to the big gig last year, started a band. We would love to play big gig if you're doing it again next year."
Totally.
Or like if you could connect us with some of these bands that are playing in the scenes like across the Carolinas and Georgia, like we would love to be a part of it. And so then he's able to connect them and get them going and like because we're connected with all of these states now, like you can do a 4-show weekender very easily now
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
because like our whole crew is connected. I mean, we're really connected like Raleigh down to Orlando and Jacksonville area. So like we can connect these small bands with all of these venues and all of these other bands to play with. And like it's very cool to see these new people come in, get invested, lock in with all of these new friends and new people, and then us go, all right, like we're here to foster it. The scene at large is here to foster this thing. Like, let's get you guys out there. Like, we're gonna help, we're gonna promote, we're gonna, support all that. It's very
Totally.
cool.
Yeah, that's sick. That's sick. I mean, that's what it's all about in terms of like, I mean, I think all of the subcultural music communities, I think it's easy for people to forget like how meaningful this is, and how like it's really culture. It's like we live in a world where everything's just commodity to be bought. And when
Hmm.
you're involved with these small cultures, it's hard to forget that like what we're doing, harkens back to primitive man. I mean, it's truly
Yeah.
community, and it's like it's super important. And I think that, on top of it, in a lot of ways, saving my own life, I think there's tons of people who, these experiences are beyond formative. And it's
Yeah.
one of the greatest things about music to me.
Yeah. It's funny you say the word community is very interesting. So we have, as of today, there's a podcast that went out today, where me and Josh watched a video of Jack Conte. I don't know if you know who he is. He's a CEO of Patreon. But he was in a band called Pomplamoose. He is in a band called Pomplamoose. They're like a
LaCroix rock.
jazz, yeah, like a jazz pop. Honestly, yeah, actually, yes. They are it's very funny you say that, because yes, they are like this jazz pop light, very good feeling, very light feeling like band. And then almost like if you imagine what like Americanized French jazz would be, that's kind of what they sound like.
That sounds sick.
It's very sick. And yeah, and he's the CEO of Patreon. So he's like, it's the way he keeps in touch with like the scene at large, which is kind of interesting. And a big thing that he was saying is that he sees the next move for music in the next 5 years as being doubling down on community. And I think for the previous 5 years from now, we've seen this rise of the individual, and we're gonna, grow as the individual and individual branding and all of this kind of stuff. And like the bands and artists and even producers, have flocked to places where it's snippets of very hard to get nuanced conversations out of these kind of like topics, and it's a minute long clip of a thing, and but we're getting it out there, and it's like mass media consumption. And his view, and he's not the only person that has even said this, it's him and then like 3 other dudes that I've listened to on like the tech business side of things, that have said that community and fostering deep-seated community similar to what we're talking about is the next move for all of these places, which is very interesting, because like that's the community, that's what we come from in a real world scenario.
Yeah. And I mean, and it makes sense to me, because I think like as our world becomes, as people kind of become ever alienated from the system, and because of technology and the way that sort of everything is commodified, I think that, we naturally have like a deep need to belong to a group. And I also think that there's a deep need to kind of be a part of group value systems. And I think that it's just normal that people will kind of seek that out. And I think for the most part, too, I'm a deep believer that like all of the subcultures really are where the majority of mainstream culture ideas come from. And so it's like when you look at, I mean, even now, it's like I remember when I was a kid, and if you were into punk and hardcore, it's like you'd get made fun of. And it's like these days, it's like you can see some person that's wearing the uniform, and they're just some dude that works at a tech company. They don't, and it's weird how it's like whether it's fashion or music or just ideas at large really percolate from the bottom up into mainstream culture. And fostering any of those communities is like not only good for the community, but it helps the mainstream culture kind of move and change. And to me, it's a big part of like when I think about what I want to do with music, it's like ultimately my goal is to in some way assist in changing the way that people think, changing the way that they imagine. And it can be easy to be like, oh, well, like if I'm just working with some punk band, what does that do? But like, it's another voice in the chorus of voices that's nudging reality towards a new way of imagining itself,
Yeah. Well, it's really, if you look at, there are 3 big people in my mind that like really resonate with that statement, which is like, if you look at Billie Eilish, who when she burst on the scene as like this massive figure, really really stuck out because of the punk culture that she was into. Like part of the reason that she stuck out was because she was dressed like a kid at a hardcore show.
Yeah. Totally.
And it was wild. It was wild. Olivia Rodrigo is another good example. Her producers and a lot of the people that she works with come from the like. She's influenced by artists like Paramore, who are very much come from the punk culture.
Totally.
And like a lot of those kinds of more female fronted bands in general. And And then you also look at somebody like, I would say, Post Malone, who straight up comes from hardcore culture.
Yeah. I mean, I keep seeing stuff online where he's spotted at just random hardcore shows at random
Yeah.
times. It's
He'll
amazing.
go to a Knock Loose show. He'll go to like some random other, like even more, way more underground hardcore shows.
Yeah.
He tried out to be the vocalist of a band called Crown the Empire back in the day, which is like, they were like a metalcore band. And now he does like, he's just kind of a lover of music, which I think people like those three being like, in my mind, like the poster child of those kinds of people who like do their thing in the larger music business, whatever, but really enjoy like this underground thing that really speaks to the way that they dress, make music, live their life.
Totally.
I think those are really interesting.
Yeah. No, me too. And I mean, I think that, I mean, as I said, it's like I think so much of what happens in our culture kind of bubbles up from the underground. And so, you know, to me, it's no surprise that like people that are at the top of their game in mainstream music, it's like in a way, it's like that's such a bubble for their experience. And it's like the best place to mine for inspiration is deeply outside of that bubble, because the mainstream audiences don't have the contextual understanding of the subcultural music. And so that's like such an easy place to borrow from, and not necessarily borrow is like, I mean, has a negative connotation.
Get influenced by. Yeah.
Totally. And for the most part, I mean, I think that that's awesome. I have less of a problem with, you know, someone like Post Malone borrowing from hardcore than I might have a problem with a hardcore band that's popular misusing its influence, if that makes any sense.
100%. 100%. There was so this is a really side tangent before I want to get into the more production side of things. Not even a side tangent. It was just a really cool instance of like the mainstream getting influenced by like a super niche underground community. So over the pandemic, a lot of popular artists were doing these like live concert experiences and stuff like that. I don't know if you remember some of that. Like they were filming these like super high production live concert experiences. The one that stuck out to me was Doja Cat. Doja Cat did a live concert experience. It was super sick. This blew up on Twitter, and I knew it because the artist that they were referencing, I am a big fan of. So she did a version of her song Say So, which was like at that point, like blowing up everywhere.
Yeah.
Like it was all over the place. But she did like a rock metal version of it, and it was really sick. And then there was a guitar solo that they went into, and the producer was straight up a Pliny fan, Plini. I don't know if you know who Pliny is.
I've heard the name. Yeah.
So he's an Australian guitar player who like falls in line with like the Intervals kind of crew, or maybe like the Polyphias, or like the Chons, like those kind of like proggy instrumental bands.
Yeah.
And so I love Pliny. I think he's awesome. He makes super cool music. And the show producer and the guitarist of the band leader played one of his guitar solos from one of his songs as the solo from Say So, like straight up, basically note for note.
Yeah.
And literally posted on Twitter and said, I did this in 100% love for Pliny, to show like, to put him on this pedestal just for a second, because I've just been in love with this record that he made. I was like, what a weird worlds colliding moment of like the most niche thing to actually literally the most popular thing at that point.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's amazing. I watched like this Nardwuar interview with Jack Antonoff, and I know that he has a background in like punk, but it was like,
yeah, he comes from kind of that world. Yeah.
He was just talking to Nardwuar, and he was just like referencing like Lifetime and Kid Dynamite and all this shit.
Oh God.
And I'm just like, dude, like me and Jack Antonoff just like the same bands. Apparently, it's like what a trip. It's so funny.
What a weird thing. Yeah. He definitely does come from that like weird underground punk and like very emo culture stuff. Yeah. But you can kind of hear that in his work too, which I find very interesting. That all of that stuff from that era influenced the guy who's making
Taylor Swift
the most
albums.
Taylor Swift albums, exactly, which
But
is wacky.
but you know, like it. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, to me, it doesn't seem crazy, but like at the same time, it's kind of funny. And I also think
Yeah.
too, like with all the underground scenes and like this, yeah, I really think this is for any of them. Is it's like it breeds such a hustler's mentality that it makes sense that people that come from that end up, you know, bubbling up into places you wouldn't expect because, you know, especially like in music, it's like it doesn't, no matter how high you get, it's like you're always have to be looking for a new angle, looking for a new take on it. And, you know, at least in my experience, it's like punk really taught me that like you can't just write songs. You got to be a van mechanic, you got to be a tour
Hmm.
booker, you got to be designing merch. You kind of have to run the gamut of it all. And so it's like
Yeah.
it's no surprise to me that people that have that experience end up in more successful positions, you know.
Yeah. I it's funny you say that. Me and a friend who is a front of house engineer, but he's a front of house engineer for like bunch of large touring acts,
Yeah,
and like
yeah.
Nick Dewar, listeners might have know who he is. He's been on the podcast before. Um, he comes from the DIY scene, and what he like metalcore, very like 2012's metalcore is kind of where he comes from. And he he said, "Bro, you will not believe the amount of high level music industry people, not artists or bands, but like producers, songwriters, engineers who have a direct tie back to the punk hardcore scene. Like
Totally.
I'm talking like grew up in a band, was into emo music, listened to like Interpol and like all of these kind of like, or like came from that, you know, either Brooklyn scene or, you know, LA, like kind of hardcore scenes. And like Shai Hulud gets mentioned a lot with like a lot of those people. And he's like, it's very weird, but I also feel it makes so much sense for the reason that you said. When you grow up in a DIY scene, you know how to eat shit and then make money off of it.
Oh yeah, and it's like it's like to me it's like one of the tenets of the whole thing is kind of like you know kind of figure making it happen yourself. You know, it's like I even before I moved to Portland, it's like I would, you know, it's like I would book local shows. I would make stuff happen. I'd go out myself and
Mm-hmm.
flyer for them. I mean, just anything I could do to assist what was going on was what I would do. And you know, the reality is that like if you're not willing to put in that kind of elbow grease with anything in life, you're probably not really going anywhere. And so I think
100%.
since the culture, the underground cultures at large really reward people that are willing to put in the time, it's no surprise to me that then those people take those skills and that mindset and end up in totally different situations, you know.
Yeah. So you started in like the hardcore scene and you moved over to Portland. And at what point were you like, I want to kind of start doing music production and like recording and engineering and all of that kind of
Um,
stuff? When did that stuff start speaking to you?
I so I was recording. So the reality is I've like never had a normal job. I'm like I'm not emotionally capable of doing that. And so I've been primarily just doing music, working in music in one capacity or another, honestly, since I was probably about 21. And so when I was in kind of in the area I still grew up in, I ended up getting this really, really nice spot, unbelievable price compared to what stuff costs these days. That was like a little multi-room studio, and then I'd have bands rented out from me to practice in 2 rooms, and then 2 of the rooms for my studio. And so yeah, by the time I was in my early 20s, it was my primary source of income. And then once I got into Portland, I sort of started to uh, do more live front of house stuff, also kind of working in some capacity with like different kinds of corporate events and parties and stuff, doing audio work. And so it's kind of splitting my time between doing that kind of work and doing studio stuff in my own spaces. But you know, soon for me, it's like I've always been a little bit of a hustler. And the first thing I recorded that wasn't my own music, I was like, I don't care how much you guys give me, but you're paying me something.
Yeah.
And then from there, once I realized that I could turn some money off of this, I was like, why the fuck would I do anything else, you know?
Exactly. No, straight up. I I think the early days, I remember it being like, if you can't pay me, you can trade me something. Which
Yeah.
like I've done that a lot. I've traded for even, I mean, I'm not so much anymore, but I harken back to like maybe 5 years ago. I traded for graphic design work.
Oh, totally.
Like,
Yeah. I have a
I'll just be like, hey, I'll nothing crazy, but like I'll mix the guy who's trying to do a hip hop thing, and he was a graphic designer, and I was like, yeah, I'll trade this hip hop mix for you for, you know, helping me like get my website stuff rebranded or whatever.
totally. Yeah. Yeah.
Easy stuff, or I'll master a song for you for something. You know what I mean? So
Totally, totally. Yeah, I've done a good amount of that stuff too. Like one of my guitars that I play all the time, it was like a homie was just like, "Hey, we're like in the middle of recording a record, and he's like, "Do you have any interest in this?" And then I was like, "Yeah, we'll just take it off the billable hours. I'll
yeah,
take the guitar,
yeah,
you know."
exactly,
So
exactly. It's the beauty of working for yourself is you can do your own thing,
totally, and
right?
yeah, you can kind of define how you work, and and what is the value you need out of it, because it's not always just money, even though like everyone
Hmm.
needs money,
Sure, sure. The yeah. So you've kind of already done this thing. I find it interesting actually that what you said is like you started in your kind of your hometown area, and then which is like I would probably perceive as like a smaller area and
hmm
pond, if we're thinking about it, and then you go to a slightly larger pond of Portland, and then how was that shift for you firstly?
in a lot of ways, so like I moved to Portland like early 20s, but like at that point I had already been like in multiple bands that were kind of like half based out of Portland. And so it's like I already was pretty integrated socially in terms of like knowing people. In one of the band I was in when I was young, that was a hardcore band. Like it wasn't huge, but kind of in the era it existed, it was maybe uh, Portland's one of the bigger bands doing what I would call like a traditional hardcore, not like metal oriented. And so because of that, like I had already sort of knew everyone in the community, as well as like had already been touring and knew people outside of my direct community. And so moving up into Portland was really the main bummer, is it happened uh, right in the financial crisis of 2008. And at the time, I don't really think I had like the wisdom to perceive this, but like in retrospect, that really did impact my business, because it went from people having more disposable income for their music projects to there being a little bit less. And so upon the move, I was uh, like started to maybe be less consistently busy, and then that's where I started to kind of integrate some live work and stuff like that. But the move to Portland was chill. I mean, it was really, in a lot of ways I consider Portland my home as much as my actual hometown, just for how long I was there and how integrated. And plus, like, Portland is a small town masquerading as a city. It's like you walk outside your door and you see some person you knew from high school, or like
Yeah.
a great story is I was like living with a homie and a bandmate, and the house next door was for sale. And then come to find out who bought it was one of my original friends that I met when I went to this house show when I was 15. And I actually took his place in the hardcore band that I joined. And then, it was like one of my oldest friends just lived next door. And that, at least from my experience being a bit of a local, Portland's very much like that, which is part of the reason I
Yeah.
was ready to leave. I was like,
Yeah.
you know, a little anonymity might do me good, but
Yeah. Let's talk about that. What made you decide to dip out of Portland and head to like the LA County area?
I mean, the reality is like I was very, I felt very lucky when the pandemic hit, because this was the only time in my adult life that I was employed. I was managing and doing all the programming for kind of like a nightclub slash music venue. And so I was able to get unemployment and get all that kind of stuff sorted, where like I have no fucking clue what would have been up if this was at a different point in time in
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
life.
Yeah.
But then from there, it was like I was really ready for a change, and my partner's from this area, and so we ended up moving down here, and then I actually built a house on my own, and so I was kind of out of the music mix for a good amount of time because, of course, that took much longer than than I had thought.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Always
so
does.
during that process, I certainly had some kind of thoughts of like, what is my, like what is happening next, like what's happening for me. But throughout the process of doing the house build, it really kind of cemented me kind of having a moment with myself of kind of like music is what I know, like this is my skill. It's time to energize that in a way that I struggled to do previously. And then also too, it's like, just being seemingly, in the mix of Los Angeles has been a positive. It's like all the networking, and I mean, not networking, but like all the people I've been able to meet so far and integrating with the community has definitely been valuable to me, and something that like Portland didn't have in the same kind of a way, just because it was so much smaller. And so
Yeah.
I'm totally a convert of Southern California now.
Oh
So
yeah, dude. No, I everybody that I know that's moved out there has loved it. Uh, and if they've had to leave, it's been they've either wanted to go back or the rat race killed them for it, and they had to leave. Otherwise, it was gonna run them ragged.
yeah,
And they didn't want to leave, and they
yeah,
didn't want to leave. It was a they. The boundary that they had to give themselves was physical relocation
yeah.
because they knew they couldn't withstand the draw, if that makes sense.
No, it makes sense. I mean, the world is brutal.
Yeah.
We're all
Yeah.
just
Oh yeah.
where it doesn't really matter how high up you get. It's like everyone's just trying to make it work.
Yeah. 100%. I. It's funny. You said the house thing. It's really funny. Me and my wife are thinking about building, and everybody that has built has said like, listen, add a year to what
Oh,
you think to what you think it's gonna
absolutely.
be,
Maybe
because like
even
we're it's same thing. Like I'm thinking about I gotta build like a spot. I want to like because we own this house that we're in right now, but we have a child now, and like it's just getting like a little cramped. Like we're fine, but it's like a little smaller than what I want it to be, and like I'm taking up an entire room just for my studio,
totally.
and I would love to have a secondary space to where like if I have people over, I don't feel like I'm intruding on my family a
Yeah,
little bit.
yeah. No, I mean
So
that's fair. I mean, at some point, this is somewhat far off, but hopefully, at some point, I'll build like a proper tracking space and can
mhm.
kind of create my own, studio that's beyond. Because right now, I pretty much just like have a mix room, and it's like
Yeah,
more than enough room for me mixing, mastering, and like making my own music. But it's not something that would really accommodate like tracking in a serious way. So
or like a larger project, like if like a longer time span of project
totally,
either, where it's
totally,
like people are coming over every single day. We're working on pre-pros, we're writing, we're
totally.
doing that whole process, which I don't know if you've seen this, at least in my area, that has become a lot more normalized again, which is beautiful to see. Like the traditional, like, hey, let's come into the studio as a band and like work through this stuff.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, I really think that having that approach really is the key to making something that has the ability to, um, take on a life of its own.
Hmm.
I definitely think a big mistake that a lot of rock bands make is just, and I've made it too, is like just writing songs and then just going in and just recording those how they've been practicing them, and not kind of giving
Hmm.
that time to incubate in what doing that in a kind of studio space or with that kind of equipment can yield
Yeah.
for them.
Yeah. Like, how does this sound when it's all properly mic'd up? Does it feel right then?
Yeah,
Like that, it does shift how you play things, how things feel, like, how
totally.
even, like, especially if you're talking like more hardcore, heavier bands, like how breakdowns hit, how
Oh,
stops
yeah, yeah.
feel, like how tight stuff is or how loose things need to be. Like, all of that is hard to know until you are actually in it,
To-
doing it.
Totally. And it's also too, it's like I think it's just the having some time to just listen back because it's like if you're playing, like just playing the song is such a different experience, and it's like being able to record an idea and like sit with it and listen to it, I think is like priceless. And in my experience too, it's like I try to listen to things under different contexts, because I think like especially like if you're writing or you're like mixing, it's so easy to like pay such close attention that you miss stuff kind of. And so being able to just have the time to like listen in a casual way, I think reveals so much about kind of if the song's hitting, if the production's hitting, if the mix is, all that.
100%. So what do you think was one of the bigger like things, lessons that you may have learned, or things that was a struggle for you when you did make the move from Portland to LA? And like kind of going into like a larger pond. Was there any, or did it seem pretty natural and easy for you, or
Um,
was there a learning curve there?
so far, admittedly, like I'm still relatively fresh in the I'm not building a house mode. Um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
but in a lot of ways, honestly, like at least for me personally, is like kind of being able to reset myself and being able to um, kind of, as I mentioned before, kind of feel like I have a little bit of anonymity,
yeah,
was really positive for me. And, it's not like there was anything or anyone doing anything negative to me in Portland, but it's like
sure,
I started to feel very, you know, like other people's ideas or my perceptions of that
yeah,
was something that really kind of weighed on me, feeling like, could I really do X, Y, and Z without people being like, oh, well, David's just that guy I saw working at the rave or whatever the
yeah,
fuck. And so
yeah,
kind of
yeah,
being able to reset that and kind of redefine who I am and at least feel like I have a blank slate with that has been super positive for me. So I mean,
yeah.
so far in being in the LA area, it's been chill. It's been great. I've met some great people who I never would have crossed paths with in a million years in Portland, and that alone has been super valuable to me. Absolutely.
No, that's huge. And yeah, I agree with you. I think a lot of people, especially when they're in like an area that they've grown up in and that they've, been in their entire life, they know everybody, that kind of vibe. It's you can get stuck in this. Well, like it's really hard to charge people like a lot of money
Oh, for sure.
when I feel like I grew up with them since I was 5.
Oh, totally, totally. And also too, I think in terms of uh, you know, I'm someone who's kind of in a persistent state of almost like a personal revolution. And I think especially too is like as people get older, it's like, they get stuck in their ways and then they get stuck in their perceptions of you. And, for better or for worse, I really felt a lot of that. And so leaving that kind of situation for me is really felt really liberating for me to kind of focus on like what my goals are and not to get so caught up in uh, kind of like just the mismatch of egos and people having judgments and biases. And a lot of this shit's like in my own head. I know that, but it was super positive for me to kind of be able to feel like I went into obscurity while building a house, and then I could sort of press reset, and then that's when I came back on the social media, and I've been reconnecting with people I already know in music and kind of starting to cultivate a new client base and all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah. So, and talking like doing the social media stuff, is that like you said that was a more recent thing for you?
Yeah, it's really only been, I probably started posting on TikTok like less than a year ago, but it's been maybe since about Thanksgiving that I started to gain. I had a video that kind of, I guess, went viral. And then from there, I've started to be able to kind of gain a following, gain momentum. And it's been, I mean, honestly, like if there's one thing I would really say to anybody, but even to myself, it's like if there's one thing I wish I was doing 10 years ago was just more aggressively self-promoting or being more willing to just put myself out there, even though at certain times I just feel like an idiot. You know,
Yeah, yeah. It's
it's
something you kind of have to learn to do. It is like kind of a learned skill, to be honest.
totally. And like, I think a lot about, and I talk with friends and other musicians about this, and I really think that in a lot of ways, like content and engaging with that aspect of our world, it's like it's kind of like its own art form and its own performance itself. And I think to kind of shed these ideas of like if you're being cringy or if you're being lame, and it can really be liberating, and obviously can help people achieve their goals. And so it's been interesting. It's definitely it's I'm kind of someone that always always looks at myself as I'm like not an expert. I'm learning. Like, I'm someone, I love information. I'm learning all the time. And I think that has a byproduct of sometimes if you talk to me, I don't have this sort of like ultimate, like I know everything. And I've realized that, maybe I post on the internet and people take me in some capacity as some kind of authority. And I've been kind of working towards embracing that and kind of giving myself some credit for my own experiences, and that like, I'm as valid as anyone else to get up here and kind of speak my mind and my thoughts on the process and production and really anything that has to do with being an artist. And it's been interesting for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think I was talking with, I think it was Shane Lance we had on the podcast
Hmm.
a while back. And I was like, how did you feel like going on socials for the first time and like kind of pointing a camera at yourself? And he's like, listen, man, be honest. Everybody's cringe when they do it the first time. Nobody's good the first time, and it takes repetition. It's a learn. Nobody. It's the same as singing. It's the same as guitar playing. It's the same as music production. It's the same as every other thing. It's just a learned skill that you have to put the reps in order to get better at. And you will overcorrect, and you will get more. You will get your professional voice at times, and then you'll be like, well, I sound like an idiot, and then you'll pull that back, and you'll like kind of figure out how to talk to the camera like it's just like, hey, I'm explaining this to somebody that I care about in a nice way, or I'm talking to this like person who maybe asked this question, and I'm trying to be as caring and nice and informational as I possibly can when answering this question or explaining this thing or whatever.
Totally. And one thing I did that I do think was really helpful is in probably like the 6 or 7 months before I got on social media, I was really just on TikTok, like lurking. And I would see, I'd see Shane's content, I'd see Greasy Will's content, like I'd see Phil's content. And I would really spend time kind of looking at what are people doing, like why does that work? And how does that apply to me? Not like how can I copy that, but kind of like what is my voice? What do I have to say? Who am I trying to reach? And that's something that I still think about a lot, and kind of imagine like who is the ideal person that will stumble across what I have to say, and like what do I want to say to them, or what do I want to project at them. And so I definitely took time to really kind of analyze the space, kind of see what was going on, and kind of see like how, to the best of my abilities, could I use that for myself to help what I'm doing and to kind of promote my own sort of point of view inside of it.
For sure. I think you mentioned Phil. Phil had a really interesting take when he and I were chatting, and it was that TikTok and the greater social media landscape is, at least it was in the 2021, 2022 period, is the new DIY space. It is the most DIY because you're taking what you have, a phone, most everybody has that, you're pointing it at your face, very little work, and you're just like, it's all based on the community that you build around those conversations. And there is nothing more DIY than that.
Totally, totally. Yeah, and for me at least, like I feel like in my own experience, it's like TikTok is much more speaking a language that is easier for me to speak. It has more of a unhinged and kind of almost absurdist element to it. which is much more naturally in the vein of who I am, where, for me, stuff like Instagram can be so kind of objectified and commodified, and I get it, and it's like I get its function for artists and bands or producers or anybody, but like the TikTok space for me, I think was in alignment of me kind of being like, oh, like the way I am that made me like the weird kid in school is like my asset in this section. But yeah, I mean, I think too, it's like, especially when you think about any of the music subcultures, it's like the younger and younger kids, they're gonna come into it through these avenues like TikTok and or people posting on Reddit or any of these social media things. And so I think that it's I think older people from that community are really doing their own community a disservice to not kind of get in the mix and kind of help cultivate what that means. Because, I know there's all kinds of conversation around like gatekeeping and punk and hardcore and other communities. But I think that there's, I think like the experience I had or people in the older generations from me had is something that is absolutely important to the health of these communities. And we should try our best to kind of make sure that we can keep kind of the historical elements of the culture in it while still understanding where it's going, understanding that young people have a different kind of experience with building community and the whole thing. It's crazy.
I'm gonna be honest, man. This is not where I expected this conversation to go, and I love it. I love it. So let's dive into maybe some more production-y things.
Sure.
So because I think we've done like 45 on higher thought concepts.
Yeah, this is most
why
of my,
I love
most
this.
Of my thoughts
Hey, yeah, and this is great. This is great stuff, man. This is great stuff. But I want to bring some value to the people that are like looking for maybe more of like the technical aspect of it. So maybe for you. Let's talk like what are you mainly using? So maybe like what's your go-to like interface or your software DAW? You're doing a lot of mixing remotely, production in-house, or no, receiving stuff, generally those kind of things.
Totally. Yeah, I'm doing lately a lot of mixing. I haven't tracked anybody in a minute. And I love tracking, but I would be perfectly happy just to stay busy mixing and mastering. But yeah, for mixing or tracking or mastering, I'm a big Reaper user. I've used it for. There's a good chance I've been using it since like 2007 or something like this. And so I'm a big fan. And then for music creation, like, if I'm producing for someone else or I'm producing for myself, or if I'm just writing music, having fun, I'm a big Bitwig user. And so I've used that since version 1, when I first kind of jumped into creating music in the computer. I was still using Reaper, which at the time was pretty cumbersome for like MIDI and these other things. And then I started to watch, the rollout for Bitwig, and then I was like, all right, I think I'm gonna hop to this. And I always think about like, I can use Ableton pretty good because the workflow is really similar to Bitwig, but it's like every time I open it up, I'm like, yo, never mind. I'm gonna open up Bitwig.
Yeah, dude. So it's crazy. I tried Bitwig forever ago, and it just I wasn't vibing with it.
Yeah.
But I was coming from Reason.
Yeah.
So like very, very different,
very different workflows.
So like mentally, I wasn't really kind of connecting. And then what's funny is I ended up going to Pro Tools, and obviously it's just good for everybody to have at least a little bit of knowledge of Pro Tools in general, just because so many people use it. You're bound to get I think having a little bit of knowledge of every DAW is probably a good practice in anyway.
Totally.
Just in general, just because you never know what kind of sessions you're gonna get. You're never gonna know what you're gonna walk into as a traveling producer.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
But then I did go to Ableton eventually, which is like kind of what I use now. And it's funny, I looked into Bitwig probably a month ago, and I was like, dang, they changed so much, and it looks so similar to Ableton now.
Yeah.
Like it feels very similar to Ableton now.
Totally. And like
which is super cool.
and this is so ridiculous, but like the main reason I never just dove into Ableton is I hate how it looks. Like I
Oh
can't.
yeah, that's a lot of people's qualm with it,
Oh
which I
yeah,
understand.
well, you're staring at it for hours, and it's like there's just something about it where it's just the look of it. I'm just like ah, and
Well, you
so
got to understand, I come from Reason, which is like very similar, which is like very blocky and
oh
like
yeah, I
everything's
remember I messed with the really early version of Reason when I was like 18 or something like this.
yeah. I was in Reason 3 is kind of where I got into it, and this was when I was in college. I want to say is
Yeah,
when I started doing it. Listeners know this, but I used to produce out of Reason. The Reason didn't have any audio, so I used to at that point like it was MIDI only.
yeah.
So I would have to like if I was producing out a guitar, I would have to learn how to make a MIDI guitar sound realistic in
That seems
in
like a
2009
yeah.
Reason.
Seems like a painful process.
Oh, it was annoying. It was very annoying. So that's when I kind of started diving into like the Ableton side and the Pro Tool side. But yeah, no, that's super cool. Why for the Reaper side of thing, is it the flexibility for you?
Yeah,
Like the ability to just kind of do whatever you need to?
yeah, the flexibility is a huge part of it. I'm also someone, I think this also ties back to punk and hardcore. It's like I'm someone where like if you give me like if I'm gonna buy a microphone, if you give me five options, I'm buying the microphone from the mad scientist working in his basement. Like I just
Yeah.
can't. It's like I love the underdog, and it's like that that part of me just gets drawn so quickly to stuff. And also too, it's like back in the day when I was in my early 20s, it was like Reaper is probably still the lightest weight DAW that's going to
It really
run
is.
the smoothest, regardless of your computer. And when I was in my early 20s, it was I was working off some home built PC that was like these days probably wouldn't even boot Windows. And so it just being a lightweight and flexible, and in a lot of ways I think has like a workflow and a layout that's more reminiscent of working on actual consoles. Like like to me uh, it's really obvious and intuitive, and yeah, it has a pretty deep ability to customize stuff too, which I've only kind of started to do a little bit more lately. Um, but yeah, it's like at this point it's so ingrained in me just how to navigate through it and make everything go quick that when I use something else, I'm like, what the fuck, you
Yeah, yeah,
know?
yeah. It's Josh and co-host Josh and our friend Lee, who's Josh's co-production partner in their business together. They they both use a lot of Cubase, and they talk
Yeah,
about the macros built into Cubase being a big reason for why they still go back
yeah,
to it consistently. And I feel like Reaper would be a similar reason, where like being able to customize all of these different functions with just a keystroke probably
yeah.
has to be pretty wild.
Yeah, I've been learning Cubase a little bit because I have a friend and fellow producer and engineer that uses Cubase, and he was like, "Yo, like figure this out. We can kind of tag team some stuff." And
Yeah,
still, it's like I'm pretty fluent in it, but it's just there's just little stuff where
there's a lot.
I'm just like, man, what the fuck? Like in Reaper, any track can become a folder, and the folder is also your bus. But in Reaper, you can have or in Cubase, your folder isn't a bus. So I have to make a folder and then make a bus, and I'm just like, dude, who's fucking thinking this stuff up? It's dumb.
Yeah.
This just
In
takes
Pro Tools, a folder is also a bus. So
yeah,
that's but it can be either or. I think there's an option to where like when you make a folder, it says, do you want it to be just a folder, or do you want it to be a folder that is a bus,
yeah,
basically?
yeah, totally. And so yeah, it's so funny to me. It's like obviously other people in their home base of DAW, they're gonna open something else up and think the same stuff. But it's
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah,
sometimes I'm
exactly.
like, oh, okay, I'm gonna learn. Like lately, it's like I'm gonna learn Cubase, and then I'm just like, man, why is this so complicated? You know?
Yeah. No, I always find Reaper being a really good first DAW for people, especially if they're going into the beginning stages of running tracks live.
Hmm.
And they need something to track demos with, but then they don't want to have something. I mean, it can be complicated, but it's as complicated as you want to make it.
Totally, totally.
That's just my experience with Reaper is like it can be as bones or as complicated as you want to make it. So for somebody just kind of getting into it, I generally say, depending on what genre they want to go into and kind of where they want to lean, I generally say Reaper or Ableton. Those are like
Totally.
my two DAWs of like, or if they're like, oh, I want to go work at a studio, just learn Pro Tools because you're
Sure,
gonna have to learn
sure.
Pro Tools
That's
anyway.
just how it
Uh,
is.
but if you're producing at home, I actually generally say to people like Reaper's a great option, and then if you don't like the way it functions, learn Ableton because if you're in a band and you're gonna run tracks, you're gonna use one of those two DAWs anyway.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, and I think for me, it's like I think that Reaper makes is overwhelmingly makes sense if you're doing band based music. It's like if you're trying
Yes.
to, make some house music, uh, Ableton all day.
Yeah.
Reaper's gonna just give you a headache. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I've used it for years, and so it's gonna stay that way until someone forces me to do something else.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah. Well, it sounds like you're willing to kind of slide and kind of go into a bunch of different areas. So like being open minded with that kind of stuff, I think is really also pretty key because there was a while where it was like Logic Pro Tools. If you do MIDI work, you're in Logic. If you do band work, you're in Pro Tools. And
totally.
like now, and like I chose neither of those, obviously,
Oh
and
yeah,
so did you.
I
Yeah, so
was
did
like.
you.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's like, I mean,
Why?
I have no qualm with Pro Tools, but it's like what I said. It's like if you line up a bunch of options, it's like, to me, it's like Pro Tools is what, like, that's like the guy on the football team. It's like, I'm not trying to kick it with him,
Yeah.
like, send me somewhere stranger, but
Well, send me somewhere stranger is a great way to think about it. Yeah, for sure. No, for me, it was out of necessity, and it kind of seems like it was out of for you as well. So it was like I had a really old PC based laptop. Couldn't run Logic on it because Logic is Mac
yeah,
only. Didn't have a Mac at the time, and I was a broke freshman in college with this crappy computer. And then at the time, Pro Tools was locked into
you had to
their
buy the
system.
hardware. Yeah,
Yeah, you had to buy whatever interface that unlocked it, basically.
yeah.
Um, which I always thought was really dumb. I never understood that. But
I
so
mean, I
like
think,
I wasn't going to buy. I at that point I had no reason. I wasn't recording anybody. I was producing like via MIDI or via the mic on my freaking laptop. So I wasn't really like doing massive productions. So
yeah,
that's why I end up leaning into the Ableton Reason side of things. I didn't even know Reaper existed really
yeah. I
because
mean,
I wasn't down that rabbit hole.
yeah, yeah. I mean, when I very first started, I was using like Sonar or something, and then it was
Yeah.
like I just I my this is so long ago I don't really remember too clearly, but I just felt like I was having stability issues, like too many crashes, too many problems,
Yeah.
and then I tried out Reaper, and I was like, yo, this works for me. We'll keep going.
Oh, Cakewalk, man. Oh, Cakewalk. I think Cakewalk. They ended up rebranding Sonar into Cakewalk.
Yeah,
Uh,
I don't even keep up on that stuff really. Who
I
knows?
I just generally try to stay in the know with some of that stuff, just in case people ask me questions. Um, but yeah. So, what interface, speakers, that kind of stuff? Are you using any outboard?
Um, at the moment, I'm pretty much just mixing in the box. I have like a couple random outboard compressors, but I haven't really patched them in lately. But I'm a big fan of the RME stuff. So I have a
Okay,
RME.
Babyface.
I have the 802,
Okay.
which has for me has been great. And as far as I can tell, I'm pretty sure the conversion is the same as the more expensive ones. It just has less bells and whistles. Um,
Yeah.
but I've had one of those for a long time, and it's been super good. And like everyone says with the RME, the drivers are super solid, latency's low, and so I've been rocking with that for a while. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah,
Some of the best conversion on the market for the price for sure.
oh yeah, I mean I think these days it's like I think most interfaces the conversion is generally fine. I think like the next step up is getting like the really high end dedicated units. I would be
Yeah, for sure. But I think if I remember correctly, like the RME and the Antelopes are like the two for the
Oh
cost,
yeah.
the highest quality that you can get at that price
Oh
point.
yeah. And
Because I think it's like $1,000 or something like that.
yeah, and I was really thinking about some of the antelope stuff, and I've got like a friend that has one and has no problems. But when I was in the process of purchasing this, I was like just doing tons of reading, and it seemed like a lot of people had some software related issues with the antelope stuff. And then I was like,
Yeah.
yo, I'll just buy the RME. It's like there's no one on the internet has ever been like my RME doesn't
Yeah.
work, you know?
No, yeah, straight up. I have messed with so same thing. I'm a UAD guy mainly because of the convenience factor.
Totally,
And I do a lot of tracking so I can bake stuff on the way in, which is really, really nice.
totally.
But I same thing. Like the other competition for me was the antelope stuff, and the amount of people and the amount of instances that I have, because I have used the antelope stuff since then. It's great. I work out of a studio around here. We use an Orion, and it's awesome. It sounds like so clean. It's so good. It's like some of the cleanest tracking, and it does exactly what it says it does at a high level. It's great. But the problem is the software is consistently causing everybody problems.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Whereas whereas like the UAD stuff, the software is easy, usable, always fixing, very, very good. And with the Antelope stuff, we had to recently like fully reset the version back like 2 versions in order for it to work.
Yeah, and that shit's just such a bummer to deal with.
Yeah,
And
oh,
it's like,
yeah.
of course, it's like things like that only happen when you actually have work you need to do, and so it
Oh,
just
yeah.
it just becomes like a total pain. Um,
Exactly.
but
You were saying you had a buddy that was.
yeah, yeah, I've got a buddy that has a studio. He's like my fucking neighbor. And
Yeah.
he's got one that he has one of the Orions, and he doesn't even use the software with it. He just it's just on, and he monitors through the DAW, and he has no problem
Mhm.
with it. And it sounds all my interactions with it have been great too. So
Yeah, so that's what we do too. The problem is that the software was bugging out so bad that it just like wasn't passing through audio.
yeah, I mean,
So like whenever even that is the case, it's like, come
it's
on,
like this
guys.
doesn't work. It doesn't work.
Yeah, come on. It just straight up doesn't work. It's like
Doesn't
get
work.
your crap together, man.
Oh yeah.
Um so what from a production side standpoint, what's some stuff, do you have anything that you've been doing lately that you've been like really excited about, or maybe something that you learned, like either a mix trick or a production trick or something like that, that you're like, oh, this thing that I did was really cool, or this thing that I learned was like super sick, or you're talking about mad science laboratory stuff. Like I love when people have like interesting things that they're like, oh, I tried this random little combination of stuff and it did this really cool thing.
That's interesting. I think lately the one thing I've been doing is really thinking about having less options. Like I spent
Mm-hmm.
some time really listening to compressor plugins like outside of the context of like doing a mix, and then really have tried to pare down to have a lot less of those to be able
That's
to
really interesting.
have more time to understand their nuance. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's been kind of the main thing I've been at lately is kind of I mean, it's so easy with so many options to kind of be on the perpetual chase of like, oh, like maybe this saturation plugin sounds cool, maybe this compressor's cool, but then you don't know them intimately. And it's like I think a lot about like a lot of the clubs I've worked in to do front of house, and it's like that's a good example of like once you learn the system. Like I worked in this one room a lot that was pretty big, but the sound system was realistically pretty shitty in the grand scheme of
Mm-hmm.
things. But it's like through learning the sound system, I could eke the most out of it. And so
Mm-hmm.
spending a lot of time, for me, I've been lately more about paring down my options and then gaining a deeper understanding of those. And then also, too, I mean, it took me a while before I started using any of these plugins that are like something like the Soothe or the
Mm-hmm.
DSEQ. And so I've been getting a better understanding of what those are really doing, and then
Yeah.
starting to utilize those in honestly in a lot more like side chaining applications. I'm a
Yeah.
big fan of the Baby Audio Smooth Operator. And so
Yeah.
I've been using that mainly side chaining things and just like kind of kissing it, like maybe side chaining guitars to the snare and just like kissing it in the frequency range that I want the snare to be able to like bust out on.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's really been kind of the main stuff lately. I mean, in a general sense, I know it's not the most contentable version of reality, but like in the general sense, I'm not really a huge believer in like tips or hacks.
Sure.
It really kind of starts, it starts at the song, it starts at the performance, it starts like in the energy. And, I think anyone that's tracked and mixed has had these experiences where like you record a band that's like in the pocket, so to speak, and it's like you might just turn the faders up and adjust a couple things and that's
Yeah.
it. And so for me now with working with people, it's like my goal is to do the best I can to cultivate the best music. And then once it comes time to mix, it's like then I'm addressing problems contextually versus
Mm-hmm.
thinking about, oh, like, I saw a video where they told me to parallel compress, so that's just what I do. Um,
Sure.
I think a lot of the content verse, which I think anyone that makes content is guilty of this, but I think a lot of the content verse tries to trick people into thinking that there's some kind of, just the right sequence of mouse clicks, and then your mix will sound like, whatever you want it to sound
Yeah.
like. And it's, to me, it's really about understanding the tools, using the tools,
Yeah.
and, knowing
I
when.
I I agree with that 100%. And I think kind of the instances where I think learning these I think so I agree with you. I think tips are fine generally. I think tips as gospel is the problem.
Oh,
Uh and I think like having these little tips and tricks and things like that are like, oh, that's a cool idea. I'll try that if I need a thing. And like it's just another thing in the belt for me. Is
totally.
like but I think with the thing that you're talking about, which I is a massive problem, is like a lot of newer producers coming up and being like, oh, this guy who I think mixes sound really cool said to do this thing. So now I only do that thing. And they
Totally.
don't understand why. They don't understand what the chain is happening. They don't understand like the reason that they do this. I found out a lot of the reason that people do, like, there's a SSL bus comp trick, right? And the reason why a lot of people use SSL bus comps on the thing is because the original version had like a side chain feature, and
Hmm.
like that no one uses it that way. But no one talks about the main reason that is the way that a lot of people used it back in the day on the on console version,
Yeah.
was they used it as a side chain. They used
Or
a
it's
side chain feature on it.
totally, or it's like the whole fascination with NS10s. It's
Yeah.
like they're shitty, and it's like the only reason that what I love about this is, from my understanding, the only reason this is such a big thing is I forget who it was. Like maybe it was like Bob Clearmountain or one of these huge
Yeah.
dudes. It's like he had some interview in some magazine, and it just happened to be in a studio, and there just happened to be NS10s behind him on their side, and then it just turns
Oh
into
yeah.
to like everyone thinks this is somehow something
Yeah.
that's meaningful. And then the
Yeah.
reality is like, if you know the monitor, sure, like obviously people are using them, and that works. But for someone like, if there was some 20-year-old kid today and he's like, oh, I'm saving up for NS10s, I'd be like, what the why?
Yeah.
Like what
I
is.
have a I have a friend, shout out Sam Bowman. I have a friend who does this really great pop mix stuff. He's an incredible producer, younger dude out of Dallas, Fort Worth area, makes these killer pop music fully in his room by himself. Only works on those pair of like $60 Sony headphones.
Oh yeah.
And he's getting placements on like a ton of major
Oh
Spotify
yeah. I
like
mean,
pop playlists.
I did, my TikTok I made today is kind of about this. It's like the number one thing. I feel like I love gear, like gear is fun, gear is amazing. But it's like, the main part of all that equation that I actually like care about is like the monitoring setup. And it's like I made a video today talking about how like the most important thing is to understand what that information is. And it's like, you can, like every monitoring system is non-ideal, like obviously some are like flatter than others and have better responses, different things, but like everything is non-ideal. And it's like, you can make pro level mixes on anything. It's just, you need to take the time to understand what that information is that you're receiving, and kind of like how that, and you have to listen to other music on it. And so it's no surprise to me. I mean, when I was in the process of building the house and didn't have a space, like I was doing mixes on headphones, and I was like, oh no, like this is the cardinal sin. But it's like, the reality is like, I've been at this shit long enough that, the people I did them for have no idea.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And there's a dude I know who does like major label rock mixes. He did an entire record on a pair of AirPods.
Yeah.
And I was like, hey man, that's awesome.
It's amazing.
I got these Slate VSX headphones recently because I thought they were super cool, and I was like, my room is less than ideal, and I don't want to put a lot of time into it, so I'm just gonna learn these super well.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's been really cool. Like, just to have the flexibility of being able to swap out what the sounds are has been really cool.
Totally.
I've been learning, but I've been only having to learn like one room.
Yeah.
I picked the room that fit my ears the most, and I learned that setup very well. And then like the rest of them are just for like, I'm gonna check. There's this one I like for low end. There's this one I like for, vocal snare balance, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But then like mainly I have like one setting that I listen to these headphones on.
Yeah.
Mainly.
I've got like a pair of little monitors that are like my main check for like vocal level. And then also they do a really good job of kind of letting me know if like the low end is like doing really what it should, because if it is, you can hear it well in these small speakers. And then if it's not working, you kind of get no bass. And so, to me,
or it eats it.
Oh yeah. I'm someone who I feel like I'll err on the thin side versus the too much,
Mixing a lot of hip hop make me generally err on the heavy low end side, so I tend to lean towards that.
Yeah, I mean, I remember the first stuff that I ever started mixing that had like synth bass in it was honestly like some of my own music I was making, probably back like 2010. And I remember at first I was lost. I was like, I had only dealt with rock bands, and realistically, like, I don't even do a lot of like low tune metalcore stuff. Isn't really my bag. And so it's like most stuff I would work with would be, in E standard, E flat for the guitars. And so I had never worked with that much sub bass. And I mean, it took me a little while to kind of understand, like, how do you manage this? And
it'll eat up your two bus real quick if you don't manage it.
It'll annihilate everything. You'll be bummed. You'll be real bummed.
I would love to know what the compressors. I would love to know what the compressors that you landed on when you started paring everything down was. As a general knowledge,
for a two bus or for individual tracks?
So because you said you kind of went through and like picked through a bunch of your compressors that you were like, oh, I want to really know these handful of compressors. I just didn't know like if you had a specific 5 or what.
Yeah, so I'm a really big fan of the Pulsar 1178 emulation, which is like the 2-channel 1176, even though my understanding is that the 78 is thought to be like a little bit cleaner than most 1176s are, but I'm a huge fan of that one. And I also really love the Pulsar Varimu emulation. That's been getting like a ton of work. And then otherwise, I am a really, really, really big fan of the Tone Project's Unisum, which is generally what I'll put on the bus. And it's a lot more of like a clean flavor, but it's an incredibly deep and versatile compressor. And I'll use it on drum bus too. I don't tend to hit vocals with it too much, but that's one where I feel like it's like every time I use it, I'm learning a little bit more, and it's so versatile that like that's a really big one for me. But then otherwise, I like that purple MC77 emulation. I just kind of, with the 1176 emulations, like I just ended up, honestly, Kyle was just like, oh, I think the goal here is less about nitpicking the sound and just picking the one that I'm going to sit with and dig into and become more and more familiar with. Because all the different compressors, kind of like the attack and release, can really subtly be very different. And I was just kind of like, I'll sit with this one and
Even
make it
the
work.
input marker and output
Oh,
variations can be like how they react can be drastically different sometimes.
oh, totally, totally. And so yeah, I like all those, and I'm a really big fan of the Tokyo Dawn Lab stuff. I use the Kotelnikov compressor a lot, which is pretty similar in sound to the Unisum, but it kind of has like it almost has like two thresholds and two releases for each threshold. And so when you're doing like, especially like drum bus stuff, it can kind of do the fast attack to manage the transients and then that like smoother release at the same time.
Interesting.
And
That's pretty
so
cool.
yeah, yeah. And so that one I really like on drum bus. And the Unisum can kind of do similar things, but they do have like a different kind of a sound presentation. But that one's really cool, and they have a free version. I've done some videos about that being like for a free compressor. Like if I had no moolah, I could do a whole record with that, no problem.
Which one was that one again?
It's called Kotelnikov.
Kotelnikov.
Yeah, and it's made by Tokyo Dawn Labs, which all their plugins are
Oh,
super.
yeah. I think I have one of their plugins.
Yeah, I'm
Tokyo
also a
Dawn.
really big fan. I need to actually buy this. I just got the demo, but they have one called Arbiter, which is kind of like something like Soothe, but it kind of works in its own kind of way. And in my playing around with the demo, it's like incredible for de-essing. It's something that I need to buy it at some point soon. I just haven't bothered. But yeah, all their plugins are super cool and a great example of like I get really drawn to like smaller companies or people that are doing it, really out of this place of passion versus something like Waves, which is just sort of a gigantic company.
Yeah.
I'd rather give my money to a dude than someone who's
100%. It
who
sucks.
knows.
It sucks that I started in a studio with Wave stuff, and I wish that I had not, because so many records I did had the Wave stuff already on it. So whenever I went out on my own, I had to have the Waves plugins because I had to be able to recall those sessions, and I
Totally.
didn't want to have to rebuild those sessions. But it's a thing I feel like that's handicapped me a little bit.
Yeah.
For the same reason that I personally really don't like the Slate stuff.
Yeah.
Not that it isn't good. It's actually a lot of it sounds really great. I actually love the way a lot of it sounds, but I hate the subscription model because I've
Yeah.
actually come into some instances now where I had the Slate. I was testing it out for a little bit, and I did like a record on it, and then like if I have to go back and get stems for that, which I had to do, I had to pay for another month of it just to get the stems printed. And like
Yeah.
that's the most annoying thing in the world.
Yeah. I try my best to avoid subscription based anything, but it's obviously,
Yeah, it's inevitable somewhere.
where the system at large is going for all kinds of different stuff.
Sure. I've been really enjoying talking about the subscription stuff. I have a buddy who has moved over to using Luna a lot,
Okay. Yeah.
which is pretty cool. And I'm messing around with maybe trading Pro Tools out for Luna a little bit, at least on some stuff. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
I struggle to find a thing that does drum editing quite like Pro Tools because I really like the way their beat detective works. And I'm just 10 years of doing beat detecting drums. I'm fucking fast, dude. So
Yeah.
you just kind of get used to it after a while. But if I'm not editing stuff and I'm just mixing, it could be a thing. I think I'm going to test it out on a single here soon, of like a smaller project, and see how I like it. But he uses they have a lot of really cool like API console integration stuff and like Neve console integration stuff where it acts like a console proper. So you mix it like you would mix faders on a console.
Yeah,
rather
like
than
it's
just
like
like proper.
emulating the different stages of the console.
Exactly. It's very
Yeah,
interesting. And he says he really likes it. He's been doing a lot of like pop country stuff.
yeah,
And so he starts in Ableton, produces everything out, gives it that character, whatever, because that's just what he's fast in. But then to give it that more natural analog feel, he ports it over to Luna and using
interesting.
all of those API console and Neve console things for different stages or buses or whatnot,
Totally.
gives it a little bit more of that like analog feel.
Yeah, and plus, like when that stuff's already integrated and it's not like having to drop a bajillion plugins, it's like it ends up being a time saver too, you know?
Exactly, exactly. Especially when you're mixing similar genres, you can create like a rough mixing template. And so things are set, and you're producing, and he produces a lot of what he works on. Not all of, but a lot of. And so he has a good idea of what he's going into the mixing stage with. So
Totally.
he's going for the last 20% character lift, clarity, separation. That's what he's going into Luna with, rather than I need to fix this thing or I
Yeah,
need to make
yeah.
this thing work together. It's like it's already kind of built out, right?
Totally. I mean, especially if you're producing the tracks, then you can kind of manage that process. So the mixing is less about editing and fixing shit and more
Yeah,
about just letting it
100%.
go.
Uh, so David, as we're kind of start to land the conversation, I would love to get some music recs from you. So, maybe like give me something, and if you need to pull out like your listening stuff or whatever you listen on, or records or whatnot in your brain, go through the record catalog in your brain. What's a project that you've been listening to that you find is severely underrated? And what's something that you've been listening to that you've been like massively stoked on lately?
Oh man, I mean, in a lot of ways, these could be the same thing, but
Sure.
I'll put this in the underrated category. So
Okay.
I am an absolutely ginormous fan of the Amare album Fountain Baby. It's
Okay.
like, and she's a Ghanaian like kind of pop artist, but the production on the album, I absolutely love it, and it has the record has way more variety than people would think. There's songs that kind of almost there's like a punk song. There's songs that have like more of an indie vibe, but like that's been a record where like when I look out into the music landscape, I'm like, why is she not at the same level as like Doja Cat?
Bro,
Like to me, that record is so good. I absolutely love it.
I picked up that record like a couple months ago off of
Yeah,
another somebody else's recommendation. So cool.
it's so
Such a
good.
cool record. It got grouped in, I think, to like an R&B category by this dude that
It's
was
future
recommending
music
it.
to me, you
But
know.
yeah, it's like very out there. It's so sick, man. Definitely see where you're saying like there's not a lot of people making anything very much
Oh,
like that.
I absolutely like. I'm someone that's like maybe one of my flaws is it's like I can be novelty will keep me around, and to
Yeah,
me, it's like that record is really on it's really on the cutting edge production wise, especially, and it really might be just as like me as like a white American man. It's like a lot
sure.
of the more kind of drum work that is obviously based in like this West African music is super fresh to me.
Hmm.
But it's like to me, I listen to that and I'm like, man, if I wish I made music that sounded like this. I don't think I can,
Dude,
but
I get the same feeling when I listen to like a lot of reggaeton.
yeah,
Like, oh man, these drum choices are so cool. Oh, these texture choices are so interesting. It's like, oh man, I wish I could like
oh
my
yeah,
white Americanness is showing right now. Like I really wish I could like be invested in this type of music a little bit more.
yeah, and I find too, like at least with the Amore album, it has it has elements of it which are almost like punk in the sense of like the music has just it's like it just propels forward. It just has this forward momentum that like makes your head bop and just kind of makes me go. And so
Yeah,
that's been one of my favorite records of the last couple years, and is something that like I'll go like if I'm writing, it's like I'll go listen to, like not to try to copy something, but just like there's some songs on it where I just put it on and I just start moving. And it's
yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
to me that's always the goal. And something else that I am stoked on, let me think. I mean, in a way, I'd be embarrassed for people to know what I really listen to half the time.
Nah, man, there is no, I don't believe in what is it called?
The guilty
Guilty
pleasures.
pleasure songs. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, something I'm super stoked on is the band VR Sex that just put out a record on Diaz. And I used to work at a club with the singer, and I dearly love him. And the record is really sick, and it's really fun, and it's kind of like a
hard copy.
Yeah, it's like an amalgamation of different kinds of punk and post-punk and a little bit of hardcore, and I've been listening to that and really loving that, and always gotta certainly show some love to Aaron, who I think is an inspiration. Really,
that's really sad. That's a world that I did not ever really like dive into, is like that post-punk kind of world and garage punk worlds. So yeah, I'm gonna have to check that one out. That sounds really cool.
This one's great, and it's definitely been something I've been stoked on lately.
Heck yeah, man. Well, David, thanks so much for coming and hanging out.
Of course.
On the podcast, we've been talking for I think an hour 15 now. So yeah. That's the conversation's kind of ebbed and flowed all over the place, which is kind of what I expected, which is great.
Cool, man. Well, yeah, thank you for having me, anytime.
Yeah, if people want to check you out or find you or follow you or whatever, why don't you run your socials real quick for those that are on them?
Yeah, my TikTok is David Alexander 2K9, and my Instagram is just David Alexander 2K. And so, feel free to follow me. If you want to work with me, by all means, hit me up. We'll make some music.
Your website is davidalexander.lol.
Yeah, .lol. So if you want to have a good laugh, you know where to find it.
Exactly. Yeah, man. Well, no, yeah. Excited to have this conversation with you. So once again, thanks so much for coming on the podcast and talking about all this plethora of different topics.
Totally.
Yeah. And listeners, thank you so much for listening. Go check out David, give him a follow, say hi, tell him if you listen to him on the podcast. And we will see you guys later.
All right. Peace.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Home Studio Hangout podcast. If you could take the time to like, subscribe. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other audio platform, go ahead and make sure you're subscribed, and also leave a rating and a review. It helps the show get out to new people, and we're trying to grow every single week. Once again, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Home Studio Hangout podcast, and we'll see you next week.